In the heat-softened summer of 1817, the great house lay drowsing beneath a pale blue sky, its tall windows thrown open to admit the scented breath of roses and dust-warm stone. Beatrice arrived in a modest carriage at the gravel sweep, her gloved hands folded with such exactness that one might mistake composure for ease. She was 24, with eyes trained to watch for danger behind kindness, and she had learned long ago that dignity was a garment to be worn even when the heart protested. Servants marked her at once as an uncertainty, too refined for a petitioner, too plainly dressed for a guest, and their murmurs fluttered ahead of her like startled birds. Within those walls waited the Duke, 26, recently come into his power, precise in speech, immaculate in reputation, and taught from infancy that rank was not merely possession but proof of worth. The dinner that night unfurled with all the ceremony of wealth, crystal catching candlelight, silver whispering against porcelain, the slow choreography of courses arriving like dignitaries. Beatrice was placed at the far end of the table, where distance masqueraded as courtesy. Conversation swelled and ebbed around her, and she answered when addressed with a voice steady enough to invite attention, yet never demand it. A landowner praised the order of her figures from an earlier ledger. A dowager questioned the circumstances of her birth with polished cruelty. Each word struck its measured blow, and still she did not falter. The Duke observed from his high seat with an expression of courteous detachment, weighing every gesture as if it were an entry in an account he intended to close. Whispers found their way through the room as inevitably as heat through open doors. Her father's name passed along the linen and glass, stitched with scandal and feigned regret. Ruin, they said. Disgrace, they said. Beatrice kept her gaze lowered only once, and that was enough to be noticed. When she looked up again, the faintest shadow lay beneath her calm, a reminder that no silence was ever empty. The Duke set down his glass with deliberate care. Whatever curiosity he felt did not soften into mercy. After the final course, he requested her presence on the terrace as one might summon a clerk. The garden lay steeped in moonlight and warm perfume, the hedges murmuring with crickets and unseen wings. There, under a sky that made everything seem momentarily gentler, he delivered his judgment with a formality that cut more keenly than cruelty. He commended her intelligence. He acknowledged her diligence. Then, like a signature at the bottom of an irrevocable decree, he told her she was unfit to be his wife, unfit to bear his name, unfit even to be considered beyond the narrow purpose for which she had been summoned. The word fell softly. Its weight was not. Beatrice inclined her head with the same discipline she had shown all evening. No plea escaped her. No protest marred her stillness. If humiliation burned, it did so behind the wall she had spent a lifetime building. She thanked him for his candor in the tone one might reserve for a benefaction, turned upon her heel, and walked back in a shadow with measured steps. The Duke remained where he was, satisfied with the order he had restored, certain that judgment, once issued, required no witness beyond itself. It was only when she believed herself unseen, pausing at the far edge of the terrace where moonlight thinned into darkness, that the cost of that order touched her face. One restrained breath shuddered free. A single tear escaped, not in haste, but in surrender to fatigue, tracing a slow, shining path that betrayed no self-pity, only endurance stretched too tight. The Duke, glancing back by accident or impulse, saw it. The image struck him with a force he did not yet have language to name. That tear did not accuse him. It measured him. In that instant, something subtle shifted, not toward tenderness, not yet, but toward uncertainty. He had dismissed many people in a short reign over his inheritance, and none had unsettled him by leaving with such composure. Beatrice, unaware of the change she had fashioned without intent, passed beyond the line of light and into the quiet corridors of the house. She carried with her the familiar weight of being judged and found wanting, yet also the quieter knowledge that she had survived the blow without spectacle. The Duke remained alone among roses and shadows, listening to the steady pulse of his own certainty as it began, for the first time, to falter. That night, As the house settled into uneasy sleep, both lay wakeful on opposite ends of the same grand silence, unaware that rejection had become the first thread binding their futures together. Morning unfolded with deceptive calm, as if the night's judgment had been nothing more than a private disturbance in the air. Beatrice took her place at the small escritoire assigned to her with quiet obedience, arranging ink and paper as though order itself were a kind of shield. The Duke passed her door once without speaking, then again with measured hesitation, and finally left a slim, leather-bound volume upon her desk without ceremony. It was a treatise on estate law, rare and meticulous, the sort of book given only to minds one trusted to understand it. She accepted the gift without comment, though her fingers lingered on the cover, as if recognizing a challenge rather than a kindness. Work followed work with unrelenting insistence, and Beatrice met it with tireless precision. She addressed arrears with farmers, organized correspondence long left in confused heaps, and corrected errors that had quietly siphoned the estate's income for years. The Duke watched these changes take shape through figures before he allowed himself to acknowledge the human hand behind them. Against his will, admiration grew, not in soft impulses, but in grudging increments of respect. Still, courtesy remained his armor, and distance his discipline. He spoke to her as one speaks to a valued instrument, careful never to suggest dependence. The household, however, had no such restraint. Rumor found new seams to worry at, fed by the visible attention she now received through business rather than favor. Whispers thickened in corridors like heat before rain, and Beatrice felt them settle upon her shoulders as a familiar weight. One afternoon in the garden, a visiting lady repeated her father's disgrace with a smile sharpened by curiosity. Before Beatrice could gather her practiced reply, the Duke interposed himself with unexpected coldness. He corrected the lady without raising his voice and dismissed the subject with undeniable authority. The silence that followed was brittle with astonishment. Later that evening, a sealed letter arrived with the crest of a distant legal office, its contents trembling between ruin and redemption. Beatrice read alone, her breath shallow as the words unfolded a possibility she had scarcely dared to imagine. Documents had surfaced. Signatures had been forged. Her father's downfall, long accepted as fate, might at last be traced to deliberate betrayal. The implications struck swiftly and cruelly, for the benefactors of that betrayal were not nameless men. They bore titles, and one among them stood closer to her than any other. She carried the burden of that knowledge through the next days with careful silence, her composure tightening rather than breaking. The Duke sensed the shift before he understood it, perceiving in her a quiet ferocity that sharpened her already remarkable focus. Their exchanges grew charged with what neither yet named. A ledger passed between their hands lingered longer than necessary. A correction offered became a trust extended. Each small moment was both advance and retreat, a choreography of restraint shaped by fear and curiosity alike. The crisis ripened at a summer gathering meant to display harmony, though none truly existed. Guests crowded the lawn beneath lanterns suspended from ancient trees, their laughter floating on humid air as if untouched by consequence. It was there that the old scandal rose again, no longer whispered but spoken with deliberate contempt. Beatrice felt the sting as publicly as the first wound upon the terrace, sharper now for its repetition. Before she could retreat into her composure, the Duke took her arm with unmistakable intent and led her away from the circle of spectators. His gesture traveled through the assembly faster than speech. He released her only when they reached the shelter of the colonnade, where shadows veiled what the world was not meant to see. He chided the offense committed against her with firm indignation, yet his restraint trembled on the edge of exposure. Beatrice thanked him with quiet dignity, but at last she did not deflect the gaze she returned. In the space between them stretched both an apology unspoken and a question not yet formed. The letter could no longer be hidden after that night. She placed it upon his desk with deliberate calm and told him only that it concerned the truth of her father's ruin. He read once, then again, his expression tightening with each line as recognition dawned with cold inevitability. The names implicated were not strangers to him, and duty stirred with alarm beneath the awakening of something far more dangerous. When he lifted his eyes to her at last, the certainty that had once ruled him was no longer whole. No accusation passed Beatrice's lips, yet the silence between them acquired a gravity that neither could ignore. He promised consideration without knowing what such a promise might cost him. She accepted it without knowing what it might restore. As they parted, the air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting upon a reckoning that had been delayed but never denied. Storm gathered over the estate with theatrical patience, clouds stacking like unspoken accusations above the hills, and Beatrice felt their pressure long before the first thunder broke. The workroom darkened by degrees, sunlight thinning to ash, and the hush that followed was not peace, but expectancy sharpened by fear itself. She rose from her desk as rain began its hesitant tapping against the windows, each drop a herald of disturbance. The Duke arrived moments later with the restraint he practiced in all things. Yet the storm had stripped something careful from his expression, leaving conflict visible where certainty once presided. He spoke first of the letter, though both knew the deeper subject moved beneath it like a current under stone. Beatrice answered with composure honed by years of endurance. Yet the truth gathered strength in her silence, pressing toward utterance like breath held too long beneath the coming storm tonight. She told him of her father's tireless integrity, of accounts kept with painful accuracy, of promises honored even when ruin followed obedience. She spoke without embellishment, yet devotion breathed through every measured word. The Duke listened as one listening to footfalls behind him in an empty corridor at the end. When she revealed the forgery at last, the names fell between them like weapons laid on polished wood. His family shadow stretched unmistakably across her history of loss. The room felt smaller for the knowledge, the air newly burdened with the cost of inheritance and blood that could not be. He confessed without defense that duty had always been his first allegiance, that he had mistaken obedience for honor and detachment for strength. The words weighed upon him as they left his mouth, stripping away the ease of judgment he had worn like armor since boyhood with inherited certainty alone. Beatrice answered not with reproach, but with the steady truth of her own labor, of years spent restoring fragments of a name others had crushed without witness. She did not beg for justice from him, only for honesty, and the simplicity of that demand unsettled him more than anger ever. Thunder broke at last, close enough to rattle the glass and loosen what restraint had yet survived between them. He stepped nearer without intent, drawn by the gravity of what he now understood. She did not retreat, though the distance that narrowed carried all the danger of confession for them. His voice softened to a register he had never trusted, and there he admitted the peril of choosing her over his inheritance, her truth over the comfort of established lies. He did not name love, yet it moved unmistakably through his hesitation like heat through storm-charged air before the strike. Beatrice felt the tremor of hope with equal fear, knowing too well how swiftly hope could be turned into spectacle. She told him that affection unfortified by courage would only repeat history under finer banners. If he could not stand with her before the world, he must not stand all. Silence returned between thunderclaps, thicker now with shared knowing. The Duke turned away as if to master himself, yet mastery no longer answered him with obedience. When he faced her again, the conflict upon his features had sharpened into resolve uneasy and incomplete as the storm pressed closer outside them. He promised no miracles, only that he would no longer flee the truth for the comfort of rank. It was a vow spoken without ceremony, yet bound with more consequence than any oath he had sworn beneath ancestral stone. Beatrice received it without triumph, knowing courage most often arrives unadorned. The storm began to retreat in broken murmurs, thunder rolling farther from the house, as if carrying their secrets outward into the darkened fields. They stood once more at a careful distance, altered yet restrained, bound now by knowledge that could neither be forgotten nor easily spoken beyond that room. Beatrice departed first, returning to corridors that felt newly unfamiliar, as though the walls themselves had leaned closer to listen. The Duke remained behind, no longer certain where duty ended and fear began. For the first time, the preservation of his name felt less urgent than the rescue of another's. Word of inquiry spread beyond the estate within days, swift and merciless in its precision. Beatrice sensed judgment turning toward her father's name once more, now edged with promise and sharpened by the peril of powerful resistance. The Duke watched the horizon as if awaiting inevitable siege and loss together. On the evening the summons was confirmed, neither sought the other, yet both felt the distance between them as a living thing. What had been spoken in storm could not be unsaid in calm. Beyond the windows, the sky cleared with deceptive serenity, as if the world itself awaited courage. The ballroom blazed with light, as though wealth itself had taken flame. Chandeliers scattering brilliance over silk and polished boots, while voices shimmered with expectation beneath the music. Beatrice moved through the assembly with measured poise, neither guest nor servant now, but a figure suspended between judgment and restoration. Every glance followed her, some sharpened with anticipation, others softened by curiosity, yet she did not slow her step. Across the room the Duke stood among his peers, posture immaculate, the storm of his private resolve concealed beneath ceremonial calm. The inquiry opened without flourish, for scandal does not require embellishment to wound. Names were spoken, documents displayed, and murmurs thickened as recognition passed whispers into certainty. Beatrice listened with her hands folded, hearing her father's life dissected into transactions and signatures, each detail carving closer to truth long buried beneath inconvenience. The weight of proof pressed upon the room with steady insistence, and still the Duke did not move. Then the final document was read, the forgery undeniable in its inelegant deceit, and the beneficiaries of that ruin were named without mercy. Blood honor stood accused in public air. A silence fell so abrupt it felt imposed by force. In that hush, the Duke stepped forward, the sound of his movement cutting through the stillness like the draw of a blade from its sheath. He named the wrong as his house's debt without hesitation, his voice unshaken though the cost settled visibly upon his shoulders. He renounced the protection of lineage as shield for injustice and offered restitution in its place. The words reordered ranks in the room, stripping titles of their illusion and exposing the marrow of consequence beneath ceremony. Beatrice felt the moment not as triumph, but as release long withheld. Whispers stirred into open astonishment as he crossed the space between them with deliberate grace. When he spoke her name, it carried no echo of judgment, only acknowledgment shaped by change. He declared before all that the account between their families stood corrected at last, that her father's honor was restored without qualification, and that the old stain now bore another crest. The eyes of the room shifted to Beatrice, as though awaiting either gratitude or collapse, yet she offered neither spectacle nor plea. She met his gaze with quiet steadiness, understanding in that instant that humility could be its own form of command. The Duke turned again to the assembly, his final words cutting through uncertainty with unambiguous resolve as he claimed her worth without condition, confessing before the world what restraint had long denied him. Shock moved through the gathering like wind through brittle leaves, yet no one spoke to interrupt what had become irrevocable. Beatrice felt the tremor of change ripple beneath her ribs where endurance had long resided. When he offered his hand, it was not as lord to subject, but as equal to equal, and in taking it she crossed the threshold from survival into choice for the first time. Society did not yield in a single moment, yet resistance no longer carried sanction once his voice had renamed it cowardice. Within weeks the announcement was made official in tones both stunned and subdued. Some doors closed with offended finality, yet others opened with cautious admiration. What had been condemned as presumption was now claimed as unprecedented devotion, and neither label troubled them. Their wedding was held without pomp, Yet nothing in that restrained gathering lacked consequence. Summer light streamed through tall windows upon a union shaped not by convenience, but by defiance refined into devotion. Beatrice stood with no ornament borrowed from apology, and the Duke wore no expression of condescension masked as generosity. They spoke their vows as partners unburdened by illusion, binding not fortune to fortune, but conscience to courage. Years later, when memory softened public outrage into curious legend, it would be said that the estate prospered not by inheritance alone, but by the clarity of those who ruled it together. Beatrice walked its terraces not as ornament, but as architect. Her counsel sought with respect rather than hesitation. The Duke's authority, once inherited without scrutiny, now rested upon a foundation proven by sacrifice. Yet on the quiet evenings when roses stirred under cooling air, they would return to the place where judgment had first been spoken, standing without witnesses beneath skies no longer hostile. What had begun in dismissal had taught them the cost of certainty untested by compassion. Their story endured not because it was rare, but because it revealed what power must forfeit to become just, and what dignity can claim when it refuses to bow. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. Please subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you.